Hi, my name's Willie Blackmore. I am the food editor at TakePart.com. And for the purposes of this conversation, I will say that I spent a couple of years not as a restaurant critic, but writing about restaurants. Jonathan Gold, on my left, is the food critic for the Los Angeles Times, formerly the LA Weekly, also Gourmet and other publications writing about food and working as a restaurant critic. And the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for criticism in 2007, was it?
7 or 8.
7 or 8, I think it was 7, my research. So anyways, when I asked Jonathan if we could do something for O&A, I told him I wanted to talk about restaurant criticism and food writing and ethics, and he said that he didn't want to do it if it was going to be about anonymity and bloggers not paying for meals. So I promise not to talk about that stuff. So these were the header title ideas that I came up with after the fact. I didn't get them to officially change it. So I thought that an interesting place to start maybe would be with your sort of pre-food writing career and talking about when you were a music journalist and writing about NWA and other gangster. Did you really coin gangster rap? Is that true?
If Dr. Dre said I did, then I'll take his word for it.
I was very excited to find this photo last night of NWA eating at the Russian tea room.
Wow.
Anyways.
First time I met with him was at Junior's Deli on Westwood Boulevard.
Nice. So I thought it was interesting that with the movie coming out, that there's kind of been this like critical reassessment a little bit of their music and like kind of locating it more in terms of like protest music, and that it was this like, commenting on police violence and stuff like that. And I know that you wrote about a little bit about a recollection of your time covering them. But it kind of struck me because it seems like film criticism, music criticism, the other kinds of critiques that are kind of considered in that same pool for the Pulitzer, they do a little bit more about commenting on telling you what's good, but also like what it means and kind of the cultural context for it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see food writing and food criticism either doing that or not doing that, because I think some people come to it and they just want to know what's good to eat.
Not to sound like an old man or anything, but when I first did it, it was very much, food critics were very much looking just at what was on their plate. That you had somebody like, Craig Claiborne at the New York Times in the 60s, I mean, way before I started, but when he was doing it, some part of it when Mimi Sheraton was doing it, they were going to restaurants. The restaurants that they would review were mostly French. They were mostly geared towards extremely well-off people, and the repertoire of dishes they were cooking were small. They'd be writing about the same 25 dishes week after week, and who had the best, crawfish in the style of Nantua, and whose, quenelle de brochette were the best. Los Angeles always seemed to me an odd place to write about that way. I mean, the great contribution of the city to sort of the world's cuisine was the idea that you could be as rigorous and you could say as much, and the food could be every bit as delicious if you were doing things in a casual style than if you were doing, escoffier or Fernand-Point style French cuisine. So you had, Wolfgang Puck at Spago, coming from the more formal Ma Maison, doing a place that basically was going to do pizza, pasta, and salad, low price point, and it became the place that everybody wanted to go to, and it was cheaper, and suddenly that became all anybody ever wanted to do here. And that, in the early mid-'80s, that spread to Europe, it spread to the rest of the United States. I mean, something would be on the Spago menu or the Trump's menu, and traveling around the country doing music journalism, I would notice that 3 weeks after something would hit a menu in Los Angeles, it would end up at the menu of a Holiday Inn restaurant in Dayton, Ohio.
Because it seems like, especially from that era, that what's eaten at restaurants, kind of when we look back, becomes a way of sort of understanding where the culture was at in a period of time. So like you have like the great scenes from American Psycho of them ordering food, and they're like hilarious because it's this like era of Reagan excess and it's ridiculous. But it didn't necessarily like, I don't know, maybe it did look like that at the moment, but it seems to become a little bit more obvious when we're looking back at it. And you think of like Ruth Reichel, who famously did this review in the early 90s of Le Cirque, where she went in as Ruth Reichel, the restaurant critic of the New York Times, and then she went in as a normal person and had this very different experience. So there's some kind of food criticism going back a ways that kind of tried to bite off something that was a little bit more, that was like kind of talking about society or talking about more of the culture, like kind of beyond what was served for dinner. But it seems like your writing has kind of always been a little bit maybe more about Los Angeles, and like you were saying, that it didn't have to be sort of high end in order to be something that was really worth talking about.
I mean, food is actually, turns out to be a pretty good way to look at things. It's a pretty good prism of experience, because everybody is fascinated by food in one way or another. Nobody eats more meals a day than I do, no matter how professionally I do it. They look like I have more meals. They're probably just bigger. Somebody who grows up with, in a certain part, if somebody grows up in Gwangju in South Korea, they're going to know way more than I do about Gwangju cuisine, no matter how many books I read about it or how much I travel, because the food will exist within the context that, in fact, it's meant to exist in, instead of it being presented as something to be experienced as something that just is. But in the context of Los Angeles, or in the context of American cuisine, it's like that, and you can tell a lot about people by what they have for dinner or how they like their toast in the morning. And when you read memoirs, you could read military memoirs where people talk about nothing for 400 pages. But if you ask somebody how they like their eggs, they're not going to lie about it. There's no reason for them to lie, and you'll possibly be able to infer more from that than you will from anything else. Like I remember as a young reporter, like sort of obsessed with the way that the multicultural mosaic in Los Angeles was being put together, and doing sort of conventional, features for the weekly, like trying to write about neighborhoods, and it's hard. You can't just walk up to somebody at a street corner and ask them questions. You can talk to a spokesman or something, or a public figure, but what they tell you is going to be really tailored to what they think you want or to what their agenda is. You can talk to friends or friends of friends, but that'll be biased too. But you can go to a restaurant, and the same person that refused to answer questions from you an hour later could be sitting at the next table, and we'll be happy to talk to you for half an hour about whatever.
When I was reading back over some of the stuff prepping for this, I've always thought of you as a resident of Pasadena. I didn't realize that you grew up, or you were born in South Central, right?
Right.
And spent a chunk of your childhood there, or?
Yeah, we moved when I was 11.
Okay. But it seems like you've kind of always had this sort of like broad-based notion of Los Angeles as a place that's worth exploring, like out to its very outer reaches, and there's kind of like almost like an ambassadorship sort of position there, that you get people to go to places that they might not necessarily think of And you did this thing of like the Pico Boulevard project, which I have a big quote of up on my computer, but not up there right now. And this was from a This American Life piece. And basically, I mean, you spent a number of years doing this, trying to eat at every restaurant along Pico Boulevard?
It probably ended up being a year and a half. It wasn't a professional project, by the way. I had a really dull job as a copy editor at the old Daily Journal, and doing basically law stuff. And you know, every day on my way home, I would just go to the next restaurant on Pico, and then you know, over the course of a year and a half, I ended up getting pretty much all the way from where it ended at Central Avenue to where it ended at the beach.
And once you started writing about food professionally, I mean, did the perspective that you had of LA and another thing we were talking about, we spent a good chunk of time earlier talking about Chris Burden and performance art and not food, which kind of is a nice way to know sort of how Jonathan comes at a lot of this stuff, I think. But anyways, Chris Burden, famous performance artist and artist in general, he did the Urban Light thing in front of LACMA and also got shot in the arm in a gallery in Orange County in 1971. But anyways, Jonathan had him as a teacher at UCLA and did this project of buying, what was it, 2 bagels from every bagel place in LA?
Yeah, I walked along the Pico Boulevard to Fairfax and north up Fairfax to Melrose, which is basically the Jewish neighborhood in LA at the time.
But this is kind of, seems like a recurring theme, like from before you were writing, of kind of like trying to like encapsulate these neighborhoods in Los Angeles through food, and then once you were doing it professionally, of trying to, not trying to get people to go there, but enticing people to go there. And maybe it's a place they haven't been to before.
Yeah, well, yeah, if there's, if there's one project that I have other than, you know, telling people, you know, reviewing restaurants, is to get people to be a little bit less afraid of their neighbors, to maybe go to parts of town that you wouldn't consider going before. And frankly, if there's a place that makes really good fried fish in Compton, that's a really good excuse to go to Compton. When you're there, you have the meal, you look around, maybe you talk to somebody at the next table, maybe you walk around. Even if you just drive there and drive back, you're experiencing something that you wouldn't have experienced before.
I took somebody to Bloodsoe's for the first time, and I think it was when people, and Bloodsoe's was a place that was a barbecue restaurant in Compton, and then it opened like a very flashy barbecue place on La Brea, which is a much quote unquote nicer part of town. And I met a friend there, and he got there before me, and he's a very nice southerly gentleman, and he was smoking a cigarette on the sidewalk, and I walked up and he goes, "Willie, is this neighborhood dangerous?" And I was like, I don't know. I mean, maybe, like, it's probably relatively more dangerous, but like, we're here, and it seems like there's some sort of value to that beyond like the experience of getting somebody to eat good food, and but like, to not have to see that through the prism of NWA, or, you know, to be able to like go and experience it a little bit.
Yeah, and when I was younger, I'd always go to, you know, Skateland appeared in the movie, and I'd go there a lot. It was the best place in LA to go see hip hop. And it was a roller rink in Compton where you had to go through not one but 2 metal detectors. But neighborhoods can be, I suppose, from some point of view, good neighborhoods or bad neighborhoods. They can be dangerous or not dangerous, but when you're there, it's just people, you know? And there's no reason why you wouldn't go to a neighborhood in East LA that made, you know, the best huaraches in town. There's no reason why you wouldn't go to a part of Linwood just because maybe the police record is, the police blotter says something else. I mean, in the early 90s, when I first started doing restaurant column for the Times, there used to be sort of a joke in the newsroom that there were neighborhoods in LA that the Times would only write about if there was like a mass slang someplace, or if I found a really good pupusa.
And I guess that kind of, you know, one of the things that comes along with that of expanding horizons is that people can kind of learn that these neighborhoods are actually really nice places, and then people start moving to them, and they're not necessarily going to Highland Park to get tacos, but they're going to Highland Park to buy bungalows, and it's kind of, you get into that gentrification game. Is that something you ever kind of think about as you've like seen these changes happen in the city and like seen what, maybe, I don't know if there's a Standard Times reader, but like might consider out of bounds, but might go there for a pupusa, and then might go there to like raise a kid. Have you ever kind of looked back at that and thought about it?
I have a little bit lately, and you talk about the different stages of, gentrification. That I'd always assume that, first the artists move in, and then, somebody opens a place that has, really good third wave coffee, and then watch out after that. But in a certain way, I might actually be a little bit before that. We'll talk about, for better or for worse, they'll talk about Jonathan Gold restaurants or restaurants on the 101 that might be in a neighborhood that people wouldn't ordinarily have thought of. So I could be on some sort of leading edge of gentrification. I'm not like super stoked about that idea. and some of it's odd, right? Like I got an email from somebody saying that yesterday saying that a friend of hers had told her that, I was the guy who ruined Jetlada.
I think it was the person that translated the menu that ruined Jetlada.
Well, yeah, but that would have been the 14 people who read Chowhound.
Yeah, that's true.
But Jetlada is a restaurant that had a completely ordinary menu that had been sort of, it had been there for 25 years before these, the Southern Thai family owned it, and they had like 6 Southern Thai dishes that were untranslated on the back of the menu. And this guy on Chowhound found it, and I went there, and I did a big, a sort of ecstatic review, like talking about the Southern Thai dishes. But the idea that I ruined it going into a restaurant that was a completely empty place that people were mostly going to for the wrong reasons, and making it into like a popular, prosperous place that people are going to for the right reasons. That is to say, to eat this sort of like interesting, adventurous, really regional food that nobody else is doing. There's not much of a downside in that to me, other than somebody having to, wait 15 minutes outside.
It can be a long wait. But I think that there's something kind of interesting about like the ability as an outsider in a place like Thai Town or in a Latino neighborhood to understand that the people aren't just Thai, but to understand that they're from a place in Thailand, and that family is from southern Thailand, and they cook in a very different way than the family at Renu Nakorn, or however you say it, in Norwalk, which is northern Thai, and that that's a really easy way for someone, it's a low bar to understand the culture of the place on a pretty profound level, like through this very personal cooking. And you may have to wait for a table, but or like thinking about like the Oaxacan influence in Koreatown, or just like kind of all the Mexican regional cuisines and how those relate to neighborhoods around the city. And that stuff would be really hard to process, I think, if we didn't have food and we didn't have people like yourself to kind of, point us in the right direction.
Food is definitely a way of, to make sense of neighborhoods that I've always had, say, followers in the geography department at UCLA. Because a lot of the times I'll find, I'll write about it like, a liquor store that has a counter that's selling like this kind of noodles on weekends. And they wouldn't have known that there were actually Laotians in that part of Orange County before. And it's a way of tracking the demographic stuff.
Yeah, this is one of the things that Dana Goodyear wrote in the New Yorker profile of you a couple years back now. She was saying that you had noted that there was an influx of immigrants from Mexico City because a certain type of carnitas was available in Highland Park that you hadn't seen there before.
Right.
And that you can kind of like trace those demographic changes very specifically to how the food is being presented in LA. which is fascinating. But it seems like that kind of culinary exploration, and maybe that kind of food writing or food criticism, that there's something uniquely tied to Los Angeles about it.
Maybe. I mean, you could do it for. I mean, you could do it for Chicago, certainly, right? I mean, trace the old Eastern European communities and the sort of newer Mexican communities and people from, different parts of Mexico and different parts of like Pilsen or along, Roosevelt. You could talk about different things in Queens, but there's something, the thing about Los Angeles is the communities are big enough, they're recent enough, they're vital enough that in some ways they don't really interact with the rest of the city that much, at least the first generation. The second generation certainly does, so that they're not cooking for you. If somebody out, wait out in Northern Boulevard in Queens, running like an Afghan cafe with 3 dishes, they're still thinking about the person that's coming in. That isn't them, and because you ride the subway, you walk crowded streets, you're always seeing people who aren't like you. In Los Angeles, it's probably not great for civic engagement that you can spend your entire life, locked inside sort of one demographic group or one sort of like language group. But what may be not good for the commonweal is really good for the cuisine.
Of course, I lost my notes on this again. So this is a mildly hard turn, but another question of kind of this broader sense of what your job is essentially is a question of kind of how going outside these notions of what it is that's good to eat and what it means to go and experience these things in a place and to have this very intimate connection with another's culture that might not otherwise be accessible to you, is this question of more kind of food politics and ethics and things like animal welfare. And reading your reviews over the years, it seems like bluefin tuna, pictured here, is something that you've kind of, it seems like that is the firmest thing in terms of I don't know if I would call it a political stance, but of being saying you probably shouldn't eat this thing.
Well, you shouldn't eat bluefin because there's a very limited population of it that they're becoming increasingly easy to catch, they're the fastest and most powerful fish in the sea. They they can swim 8,000 miles in a season. They're the only warm-blooded fish. And if you go to a place like, Tsukiji Market in Tokyo, which is like sort of a bluefin Auschwitz.
Yeah, well, and this is, that is from there.
But you wonder how there are any left at all, and if people don't make a conscious effort to not eat bluefin, I don't think our kids or our grandkids are going to be able to eat something. The populations are down by something like 90-95%, and some people say that as a restaurant critic at a place like the LA Times, I'm not supposed to be political. I'm not supposed to talk about stuff like that. But that's almost like asking somebody not to talk about the truth of global warming. It's important.
Well, and also your role as a critic, you're not covering restaurants as a journalist. You're
right.
not, and it'd be unfair, I think, in terms of how we define criticism within media, to say that Manohla Dargis can't write about a film and comment on, how it handles relationships with women, which is something she's written about for the New York Times a lot and in a really powerful way that is quote unquote political. But again, going back to kind of how I was opening with, it seems like we sort of want to push food writing off to the side in terms of criticism and say that that's not necessarily the place for you to get up on your high horse about fish stock depletion.
Well, I do that. I mean, I wrote really extensively about shark finning, I mean, which is barbaric, and the shark populations were plummeting. And I wrote an editorial. I was at the Weekly, but I wrote an editorial for the Times on shark finning that supposedly was enough to get the state senator who had been blocking the anti-shark finning bill to like withdraw his objection and get the bill through. As journalists, we have power and we have responsibility. And just because something is really delicious, and I will admit, bluefin tuna is really delicious, doesn't mean that we should be rooting for its extinction. And I mean, when we're talking about the ethics like that, one of the things that other people wrestle with probably more than I do is foie gras.
And I mean, were you happy to see that kind of come back in California, or I mean, what do you think about that?
I'm actually not I don't think that I'd be allowed to write about foie gras as a critic in the way that I need to, which is to say that I am perfectly, having witnessed the farming and talking to people and talked to a lot of people about it, I'm perfectly convinced that foie gras is as humanely produced a product as any meat product in the United States.
Probably more so.
Given the peculiar physiology of waterfowl and the way they feed and the way that they stuff themselves before the. I mean, there's a lot of things we could talk about all night, and maybe there's people out there who want to slit my throat on the way out. And it became having it banned became a very particular pet project of the head of the California Democratic Party. It was his passion to have it banned. He had done a lot of great things for the state, and this was what he wanted. And it wasn't going to be denied to him. It was overturned in the courts. But the people who are sort of on the people who are behind the bills that would allow foie gras to be sold here, and it is allowed already, but are not people necessarily with the best interests of the state in mind. I mean, they're trying to do it through the Interstate Commerce Clause, which means that they're huge multinational food companies like Purdue and Tyson that don't do business in the state of California much because we have, strict laws on how much,
Proposition 2.
Yeah, how much, space that a chicken be allowed in its cage, that they're not allowed to be fed antibiotics, that they're not allowed to be treated in certain other ways that they are in almost every other state in the union. And the people pushing to reinstate foie gras are doing it on those grounds. They could care less about foie gras. That's just their stalking horse.
So I mean, it's clearly this is stuff that you are considering and thinking about. And I know that before Lindy and Grundy, which was a sustainable butcher shop that's now no longer here, that you would line up at McCall's to get parts of those sustainable hogs that get from Free Ride Ranch.
Yeah.
And it seems like at home, from what I can tell, that you kind of do spend money to get really good pork that tastes great and is raised maybe in a better way than something else might. But I haven't necessarily seen kind of that's the same sort of attention to detail, not attention to detail, but the same consideration of these questions as they relate to, say, bluefin for other meat products and some of the stuff that you've written about.
Well, if a restaurant has sustainably raised pork or cattle, then I will almost always mention it. If if they're using farmers market produce or they're growing stuff themselves or they're doing something special to source the food that they're bringing in to cook, I will mention that. What I don't do necessarily is I don't police it. I don't police like the source of protein maybe as carefully as I should. And I'll give you an example. There's it's not in LA, but when I was at South by Southwest earlier this year, I made sort of like the pilgrimage that a lot of people make to this famous barbecue place, whose name I'm not going to mention, but an hour and a half outside town. In this town is the local cattle auction house. It's sort of like the cattle center of that part of Texas. And I had always assumed that the barbecue, that there was some sort of symbiotic relationship between this barbecue place, which runs only on Saturday mornings, and on the the people raising the cattle, the sort of like processing of the cattle that took place 150 yards away from it. It's really, really good barbecue. And I was, after I'd had the barbecue and I was walking around, and I noticed this giant stack of boxes from IGT, which is sort of the very lowest of the low-end meat processor in the United States. And I realized, and in fact, I chatted with the owner of the barbecue about it a little bit. That's the meat that they get. If you go behind, some of my favorite, say, Chinese or Korean restaurants, if you happen to, walk in the alley, I mean, you'll see, similar boxes from people who are not practicing what I would personally consider to be best meat practices. But I'm not at the stage where I think that I can call them out. And especially I write about, I'm probably best known for writing about, mom and pop, Asian and Latino places, but, I'm the restaurant critic for the paper. At least half, 2/3 of what I write is, higher end stuff. But calling out somebody who is not doing higher end stuff because they're purchasing meat that's at the price that allows them to charge the prices that bring in the people to eat the food, to keep the food real, seems to be hypocritical in a way too. It's something to wrestle with.
And there's some weird line that's very hard to define, I think, where it becomes a question that's reasonable to ask, in terms of like the if it's a high-end restaurant or if it's kind of more of a mom and pop place. Mm-hmm. But I had an interesting experience a couple years ago at Guelaguetza, which is this very famous Oaxacan restaurant in Koreatown that Jonathan's written a lot about over the years. And they were doing they did like mole turkeys for Thanksgiving.
Right.
And they were like, you could like order one. So you could get one that was like, and that's like a very traditional, it was a roasted turkey, but like very traditional mole preparation is with braised turkey legs. And so I went during the day once, and they very generously like made this mole turkey for like me. It was Bricia and her mother, whose name escapes me right now. But I was talking to this woman who's run this restaurant, and they came from Mexico, I don't know, probably in the 80s. And she was like, yeah, it's kind of a bummer because like these turkeys are terrible. And she's like, the stuff that we'd have back home would have been like out in like, and it wouldn't have been in like some like very idyllic sort of Portlandia idea of a poultry farm, but like, the turkey would have like ran around, the area around the house, and it basically would have been a pasture-raised bird, which was the word she wasn't using, but saying the same thing. She's like, this thing tastes terrible. It doesn't taste like anything. And it kind of sucks because, not how she put it, but like she was like, it's frustrating that we can't get that. And we can't have that kind of meat that we would have back home because it makes the food taste better. And it's just like, I've never known what to do with that other than to like kind of remember as an anecdote that it's not necessarily is not only when you get up to that level, and it's not necessarily a question of like ethics, it's actually kind of a question of flavor at a certain point, but like that it's not that a mom and pop place isn't thinking about that stuff. Their frame for thinking about it might be different, but there may still be something there.
Sure, but I mean, you can get great turkeys in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the whole range of heritage stuff that you had. There's, the Mary's Ranch in the Central Valley has figured out a way to do it on a, big enough scale that every Whole Foods has, tons of them. And there's a Vietnamese called Vicon that raises like essentially, pastured. Rare breed chickens that aren't like sort of the GMO Franken chickens that are 98% of what's available. But it's expensive, and even if a Vicon bird runs maybe $8 at a supermarket, it's still $3 more than $5 at the supermarket, and people probably aren't going to pay that much money to do it if they're going to keep their whatever 25% food cost that you have to have.
I've managed to lose my notes for this twice today, which is awesome. But Mark Bittman, who was for 5 years food columnist for the New York Times, writing about like food issues, writing about turkey production or whatever. He was on Good Food like last weekend and talking to Evan Kleinman about kind of how his career has shifted over the years and now moving away from writing. And he was kind of talking about how he started out and it was kind of about like the joy of cooking, the joy of restaurants, and then it became more about how that sort of related to questions of health and questions of environmentalism and questions of climate change. And it seems to me that kind of some of that change first started happening at Gourmet under Ruth Reichel and Jonathan's wife, Lori Ochoa, who was the executive editor there with Ruth in kind of the latter years of the magazine. And I always point to this story that Barry Estabrook wrote about tomato farming in Florida, which was basically like slave conditions. And that picture in particular is not kind of the picture of tomatoes that you would look to find in like a glossy food magazine. And then this year, the LA Times has this big investigative piece about working conditions on Mexican produce farms growing tomatoes for Americans, and kind of how they were really terrible places to work for the employees. I was just kind of wanted to ask you how that sort of era of Gourmet, where you had David Foster Wallace considering the lobster, and then you had a recipe for lobster bisque, or you had Barry Estabrook writing about slave labor conditions on tomato farms, and then perhaps like a panzanella recipe, and kind of that duality, which probably seemed kind of weird at the time, but I think has kind of like become the direction that food writing has moved in. If sort of that had any effect on you when you were working in that environment.
I mean, not particularly. I mean, I'll leave this story for Ruth, who's writing about it in her new book. But the thing of the David Foster Wallace article going through, let's just say it was not universally loved by everybody having to do with the magazine.
Right.
And including some of the people we would ordinarily talk about, whose names we won't bring up. But there are always going to be those issues, and people are going to eat tomatoes, and people are going to eat panzanella, and we hope that they use great tomatoes, and that they're completely delicious, and maybe they're coming from a backyard, and maybe they're coming from a good grower like Tutti Frutti or Chino Ranch. I mean, where those issues come to a head for me maybe was when I was writing about a dish called sannakji, which is a traditional Korean preparation. Maybe you've seen it in the film Old Boy, where a octopus is killed by putting a live octopus is killed by driving a knife through its head, and then the tentacles are put into chunks, and it's like served to you like on a plate with a little sesame oil to dip them in. And the alarming, almost horrifying part is that the tentacles still move around. They'll climb up your chopsticks. That the suckers will latch onto your tongue and not let go. Which is why you use the sesame oil, partly because it tastes delicious, but partly because it lubricates the damn thing. And for years, I'd assumed that it was sort of the way that a chicken will run around when its head is cut off, that it was just sort of involuntary muscle things. But reading more and more about octopus intelligence
really smart.
and octopus physiology, it's like, oh, wait a second, their brains aren't in their heads. They're as much in their arms. And so it becomes, what was an amusing novelty dish became something that was slightly horrifying to eat.
Maybe that's why it was an Old Boy in the first place.
It could be in Old Boy, like just one of the astonishing movies of like new Korean cinema. There's one of the characters, or the main character, wants to taste life to its fullest, so he goes to it. He takes an entire live octopus and crams it down his throat and suffocates.
I want to have a couple of minutes.
This isn't necessarily about food, that part.
I think it is. I would argue that it is. I want to give people a chance to ask some questions, to think about it. But I wanted to briefly kind of cast things forward a little bit and ask you about some of the stuff that Roy Choi has been doing and this whole new idea he has for local, which is this sort of fast food. Well, he's like, it's a fast food restaurant that it's going to open in Watts. They're going to have a cheeseburger, but it has tofu in the thing, and it's this very sort of, it's cramming a lot of these ideas into one place about getting people to experience different parts of the city that they might not necessarily go to otherwise, about issues of class and race, and issues about health and sustainability. And it seems like this is kind of a locus point for a lot of his stuff in this project that he's doing. And obviously it's not open yet, and you haven't tasted it, but as someone that's followed his career over the years, from starting Kogi in 2009 to kind of some of his more recent endeavors, and that flirtation he had with vegetarianism that freaked a bunch of people out, but I thought was kind of interesting and heartfelt. Just sort of, it seemed like a good way to wrap up this conversation.
Yeah, Roy's an interesting guy. I mean, he was first in his class at the CIA Culinary Academy in New York. He worked at Le Bernardin, which is the best seafood restaurant in the United States. He did big hotel restaurants here, like I think at the Beverly Hilton, and he sort of chucked it all to open truck selling Korean tacos that launched the food truck craze in the United States in 2007, 2008. I mean, he's the real deal, and I think part of that, training and the idea of being a banquet chef in a big hotel, helped them be able to serve huge amounts of people from a truck. He owns other restaurants here now too. But he's almost chucking it all, and this guy, Daniel Patterson, who was the chef at a fascinating, super high-end restaurant in San Francisco called Qua, has basically quit his restaurant to go in with Roy on like we're saying, a chain of restaurants in extremely impacted neighborhoods that are going to sell, healthier, better, tastier versions of fast food about the price point of McDonald's, that he thinks that by doing that, he could do more to increase the health and the vitality and the happiness of the United States than anything else he could do. And when you listen to him talk about it, it's really infectious. And the idea that Daniel would quit his 2-star restaurant in order to do this full time. I hope it works. He's setting the bar really high. His first restaurant is going to be across the street from Jordan Downs, which on conceivably the roughest block in the state of California. I almost wish that he'd sort of like inch towards it rather than
ran right up to it.
But it's something I'm going to be actually reporting on a lot in the next few months. And I don't know. I hope it works.
I do too. So more on that eventually. But if anybody has any questions, there's a microphone, and they want to have you go up to it so it can be recorded. So head on up to the front.
Hello. I was curious, what kind of food journalism writing do you enjoy?
Good food journalism. The National Eater site has a new sort of like long form channel that I've been loving. Just read the best book on octopuses. But I'm at this point I'm almost bored by restaurant reviews. I mean, there's sort of if somebody's going to take a new tack on it or find something, but I suppose there's always something interesting to look at. And looking at old stuff, I mean, I know it's the old dead white guys, but it's like Joseph Mitchell and Liebling, and I guess he's not dead, but Calvin Trillin or the MFK Fisher. There's some. We're in the golden age of food journalism, though.
Yeah, that Eater long form thing is great. They've had some really, really good stories in there.
Yeah, Helen Rosner, who has like a really good, strong sense of place, and the most interesting threads of it, the most interesting people writing about it at the moment are writing about sort of about feminism and food, about the feminist aspects of like cooking and eating, which is completely great. It's something that's nobody's ever done with this kind of verve before.
How do food fads begin? Like, how did the quinoa fad begin? Do people like yourself, do you write about it and then people start eating it? And it's not a fish, but there are some issues about it because the poor people in the Andes whose food it is are now not being able to afford it because it's being exported so that foodies in this country can enjoy the quinoa.
Yeah, I remember a really early experience with it. I was in Peru reporting on the International Potato Center and the sort of things they were doing to preserve rare potatoes. And I went to this workshop in the Barrio San Salvador, which right outside Lima, which it's huge, right? It's like, it's an informal slum, and an informal slum with like 1 million people living in it. And these women were going to this cooking workshop because they were which was teaching them how to cook with indigenous ingredients because they were going to get food afterwards. And they sat through the potatoes and they sat through something else, and then it's like, then quinoa came up, and it's like you could just see the look of horror on their faces. It's like, we walked here from the Andes with our families, and you're giving us quinoa? That's what we were escaping from. Anyway, Sometimes you know where food fads start. I mean, the blue corn thing I could probably trace. I could probably trace kale if I wanted, but I'm not sure where quinoa came from. I think that may have been more marketer driven than it was writer driven, but you can never tell. Yeah, but that is a problem with the price of quinoa going so high in Peru and Bolivia, where it's a really important part of what?
And in Ecuador too.
In Ecuador, yeah, where it's such an important thing of protein.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hey, so I guess my question is, when you talked about going into sort of, Queens or, going into a Thai neighborhood, how do you cultivate food writers from the areas so they're writing about their own food, so it's not like, oh, there's white writers writing for white audiences about like, whoa, exotic, quote, food. So what's the responsibility of the food critic there?
Well, as a food critic, it's not my responsibility at all. My responsibility is to write about what exists. And if what exists is that's what I'll write about. Am I happy when when I run into people who can write about that? Yeah, I mean, when I run across people who can write, really well about the food of their communities, they're writing for us within weeks. I mean, we have, I hate what it's called, but like this network of food scouts at the Times. And if anybody's going to write well about anything, I want them to be on my team.
Well, like Javier is probably a good example of somebody that you met when he was like still in high school, and he's like the editor of Vice Munchies for the West Coast now, and he,
It's
is,
true.
is writing about his community.
I started encouraging him when he was 15 years old, and yeah.
Hello. So I feel like I should apologize in advance for this question because I know that you don't want to talk about the anonymity, but I have specific instructions because I'm coming from a paper where we're considering our food critic not being anonymous. So I was wondering what the impact of not being anonymous has had on the dining experience and on the writing of the reviews, if any.
Two things. One, probably in the best of all possible worlds, a critic would be anonymous. What that means is that he or she couldn't talk in forums like this, or lecture at universities, or engage with the public in any particular way, which is fine. But in point of fact, if a restaurant needs to know who the critic is, the restaurant knows who the critic is. The fact that my coming out as not anonymous was it was an afterthought. I hadn't been anonymous for years. I mean, restaurants know who the critics are, always, without exception. Sometimes you'll be able to slip in for a meal or two, but as far as being able to live out their careers anonymously, it just doesn't happen. It's it's fun to talk about. Ruth Reichel made a point of disguising herself at points, and I was out with her, a lot of times when she was in her disguises, and I think there was only one time that they didn't figure out it was her. And it's because the outfit made her look a little bit like Linda Tripp, which was alarming, but.
Is the trend that fewer critics are being anonymous?
Well, I don't think any critics are anonymous. And especially in the age of social media, where, I find myself being on somebody's Instagram before I've had a chance to order my first cocktail.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
I was wondering, what do you think the role of food writers is in, you talked a little bit about environment, but what about health? I mean, a lot of the food that we're talking about, lots of alcohol, lots of foie gras, it's not really healthy for us, and, you know, food writers tend to praise all these things as just being wonderful. Is there a role for a writer to talk about health?
There is. It seems to be like a category of food writers. I mean, it's like restaurant critics maybe don't talk about it that much, and sometimes I wonder about it, especially during times like a couple years ago, where everything that every chef was doing, you know, had innards in it and had bacon in it, and it was confit and lard and then fried crisps and duck fat. And it's a particular kind of eating that's delicious, but kills its customers.
And we're exporting it to like every other country in the world.
Well, we're not exporting that. And there is this idea that there are dishes in every cuisine that are, let's say, festive meals, right? They are things that, you know, if you were going to, you know, live in China or you're going to live in Mexico, it's something you'd eat once a week or once a month, and because we're eating it every day. Stuff that nobody is supposed to eat carne that's every day, right? It's just, as good as like pork shoulder seethed in its own fat is, it's not sustainable on the body. But again, as a critic, you report on what exists, not what you wish exists. You can't write about you have to write about the restaurant you're in. You can't write about the restaurant that you wish you were in. And sometimes it does mean that we place too much emphasis on certain things. And I've wrestled with it a lot in that I don't write as much as some people think I should, say about the vegan restaurants in LA, of which there are many, many. Because most of them just aren't very good, right? I mean, they're not. They're not. And writing about like this pink library paste is slightly tastier than this pink library paste. It's just not my bag. But you know, as a responsible critic in LA, should I actually be thinking about that stuff, or should I be talking about how the meatless pozole at one restaurant would almost taste like real pozole if you drank enough? I don't know. I mean, it's definitely something that I think about, and it's definitely something that I wrestle with. And I definitely avoid writing about the fat on fat restaurants. I mean, the people who do like, you know, gimmicky burgers that are half bacon by weight, or people who, you know, sort of the breaded, deep fried, you know, Mars bar approach to cuisine. It's almost as repulsive as raw vegan food.
So you just kind of set up your own standards.
Yeah.
Hi. So I've read your reviews over the years, and I've called some of your columns like fear factor columns. Like, they're foods that I find to be super challenging, but I think that they really speak to authenticity, and I think that that's something that you pride yourself on. I wonder how you navigate the tension between sort of foods that are challenging and challenging your readers to go to different neighborhoods, but also maybe eat pig snout or whatever the case may be, versus sort of helping a family. Well, I know it's not your role to help a family, but as you mentioned with Gelada, your reviews fill restaurants. Is there a tension to navigate there, knowing that, you know, you can draw people out to eat unusual foods?
It's interesting you bring that up, because I think there were a lot of people who sort of, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but you know exactly who they are, who do actually play that fear factor thing up. I mean, even some people that I respect will go, say they'll do a TV show on Cambodia, and they'll go to the one village that ate spiders for a bit when Pol Pot had exhausted every single bit of protein that was possible to eat in that village, so they sort of ate spiders for a while, and then they'll eat spiders when like tourists pay them to eat spiders. That's not food, that's not something that you need, that it doesn't belong within the context of like Cambodian cuisine or Khmer cuisine, which is one of the, the most delicious and varied and actually plant-based in the world, that the sort of eating gross out food just because you're eating gross out food, I don't like, because it's taking people's traditional cultures, and it's almost like pointing at, look at these foolish people, look at what they're eating. You don't want to be one of those people. Yet it's also true that if I'm going to say a carnitas restaurant, and they're in the traditional Mexico City style, and there's 8 kinds of carnitas, and one of them is like pig uterus carnitas, I'm also going to eat the pig uterus. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist. And I guess my thing is, if it is important within the context of the cuisine and the culture that it's being presented, then that's great. And if it's some weird outlying gross out thing, then maybe it's not. And I know I sort of encourage people to do the sort of fear factor eating, that I sort of, not encourage, I definitely enable them. And I do occasionally worry about that.
So I tried doing a little food writing on my own before kind of abandoning it for being a copy editor.
Copy editors are so important.
Oh, I love my job, but
Good.
I do miss food writing from time to time. So one of the reasons I stopped doing it was, one, the pay is terrible, and it's hard to live on it. But 2, I kind of stopped enjoying eating, and maybe I'm doing it wrong. You've been doing it for so many years, how do you separate the business, your job, from still enjoying eating and going out to eat and cooking and that kind of thing?
I'm not sure I can separate, writing about food from eating food. I mean, there was a point, early in my career when I was writing about restaurants, I was writing about music, I was writing about films, I was writing about art, I was writing the occasional architecture piece, and the editor of the paper asked me if I wanted to try my hand at writing a relationship column. And I was saying, no, I have to have one part of my life that's completely unexamined in print. So I wish I could turn it off. I wish I could just go someplace and eat a salad and not worry about sort of the provenance of the cucumbers. But I don't know. I guess that's the price I pay.
When I was writing about restaurants and I did have the opportunity to go out to eat that wasn't about work, my rule is that I wouldn't take pictures of food if I was eating for pleasure, that I didn't have to do that part of the thing, that I was just able to eat and not have to set it up and do all of that. But there is, the way that you think about the things that you're eating and the way you read a menu and the way you sort of examine a place is changed. And it's not necessarily bad, but it's kind of hard to get away from. When I'm not eating professionally, I tend to go back to the same place over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, it drove my wife absolutely batty that we'd have the same grilled cheese sandwich at the same restaurant every Saturday afternoon. But it's a really good grilled cheese sandwich.
It's good.
Thanks.
Hi, what are your thoughts on food Instagram accounts and restaurants changing their lighting and plates so so there's better aesthetic for people taking pictures of their food and just how everyone is kind of like a mini food critic on social media now?
Well, I think people like enjoy taking pictures of food and they enjoy sharing it on social media. And you know, some restaurants have like, you know, adjusted their lighting, they've adjusted their plating, so things are, you know, totally Instagram beautiful. And I was just thinking the other day about this restaurant I've been going to called Maud in Beverly Hills. You know, really good restaurant owned by a celebrity chef. Yeah. And I swear the lighting there seems deliberately designed so that every Instagram picture is shitty. Because there's all this horrible, murky, pinky brown when you look at the dishes, and yet they're beautifully plated and presented. So I don't know if it makes people happy, and as long as they keep their flash off, it's okay with me. Sushi chefs hate it because they think you should eat everything within like 1.5 seconds of it hitting your plate, but other than that.
So I have one more question.
Sure.
So if someone's like just starting off and, you know, like food writing, how do you stand out in like an age where everyone is kind of, you know, posting pictures of their food and like writing about it?
Be really good. I mean, it sounds strange, but there have never been more outlets for food writing. I mean, when I first started doing it, it's like, you know, there was, you know, there were, what, 4 or 5 of us in town. There was like, you know, me at the Weekly and Ruth Reichel at the Times, and, you know, somebody at LA Magazine, and that was it. And now, how many food writers are there in LA? Dozens, right? A lot. Dozens and dozens. And everybody's looking for somebody who's going to look at something in like a fresh way. So if you, it sounds like sort of rudimentary to say a thing like this, but if you do blogs and you do tweet and the stuff that you do about food is beautiful, and you sort of let people know about it through social media, people are gonna find you because they always want something that's great. If you turn out to kind of suck, then you'll disappear, but that's okay too. There's a lot of different things to do, and I'm assuming you're great. So.
Yeah, I want you to talk your impressions on this food revolution at airports, where you have these gourmet restaurants coming in, and as I understand it, they buy the name of some restaurant, but then it's actually the host Marriott chef after some initial training who's doing the cooking. So can the quality be as good? And the second part of the question was, like you have Ford's filling station or in the American Terminal Campari that closed, and now it's only open at the airport. So why are they picking restaurants that no longer exist in LA?
There's different schools of thought on that. I mean, I know that there's, let's just say I talked to the owner of one of the restaurants that you mentioned, where some people that had been involved in the finance end of the restaurant involved had sort of like leased the name to the airport, and the food there under its name is just dreadful. There are other people like, I mean, I know the Kogi people are actually pretty proactive in seeing the stuff that goes out under their name. That the people from like Inksack, I mean, and Chaya are really sort of involved in the product that goes out under their name. I don't know if you've ever been to one of those hearings where they're trying to figure out who gets the franchise to do things in what terminal, but it's just appalling. I mean, sometimes I think that people should have that the lawyers and lobbyists should have signs around their neck with like numbers going like a taxi meter, so you can see exactly how much per hour is being spent to persuade them. But the food in the airport is so much better than it was even like 3 or 4 years ago, and anything that's going to keep that up is great. And if it doesn't, then at least it's not Carl's Jr.
Cool. Well, I think we're officially over time, but cool. Apparently there's nothing else in here after this. But thank you, Jonathan, for doing this, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks.